Japan up close.
I was first interested in Japan as an undergraduate student in Germany, and I was enrolled in some other studies, but I was really fascinated by the fact that there was, at the time at least, no typewriter that was often or regularly used for business. And it was just in the years in the 80s when Japan became an economic power to reckon with. And I was just curious, how would a language be structured that we cannot have a typewriter for it that would make business easier? And of course, then I had to learn about kanji. And it was like 15, 20 years later, when finally we got a computer, or the Wapro at first, and then the computer, and then we could actually use, uh, uh, you know, non-handwritten business documents. But in the meantime, that initial question was also the reason why Japan came to dominate the fax machine industry in the 1990s, because the fax technology was actually developed in California, but Americans didn't see what problem that thing would solve, because the telex was perfectly fine. But in Japanese, the telex didn't work. The fax solved a big issue, because if you do most of your business in handwritten documents, the quality of the fax transmission makes a big difference. As those of us who have studied kanji know, a little dot here or there, or a smudge here or there may change a meaning. And so I started with the kanji and the language and the culture, and then I took a trip to Japan and liked it. And I thought it was so different in fundamental ways that, as a social scientist, one could study this country forever, because it would always have an alternative way of doing things, or an idea for an alternative way of doing things. And so, long story short, I ended up as a professor of Japanese business, where I am interested in what we can learn if we compare different ways of organizing business, and whether that's employment systems or business groups or business strategies or business systems and regulation. And so that is that has become my calling. And I made studying Japanese business and business practices my main research focus. Yeah, so my book came out in 2020. I was struggling to get it out in time for the Tokyo Olympics, and I succeeded. It was published in June 2020, but then, of course, the Olympics did not happen in that year, unfortunately. The book is about the ongoing business reinvention of Japan, and not the entire Japan, but Japan's leading companies. The purpose of writing this book was that there's so many, the puzzle that I'm trying to answer with this book is that there's so many negative news about Japan. We hear about the aging society, demographic change, shrinking society. The regions are atrophying. There's government debt. There's no growth. There's low productivity growth. And some people even claim that Japanese companies are no longer innovative, which I'm not sure is true. But most of these negative news are actually true. And yet, Japan is still the third largest economy in the world. So there has to be something in Japan that's working. And so rather than looking at all the things that are not working, of which there's large literature, I thought I'd write a book about what explains that Japan is still the third largest economy in the world, upholding a good advantage over Germany, which is in the fourth position. And what are the Japanese companies doing that are at the forefront of Japan's business reinvention? How are they changing? What are the obstacles that they have to overcome? And why are they changing? And this last question of why they're changing is, of course, immediately related to the rise of China. So in the late 1990s, not only did Japan have a banking crisis and a lot of domestic issues after the burst of the bubble, but Korean and Taiwanese companies were getting better and better at Japan's own competence of mass producing consumer gadgets and electronics and office equipment at very high levels of quality. And they could do that cheaper than Japan. And so Japan was losing its competitive advantage in consumer end products to South Korea and then Taiwan. And then also, by the way, later in semiconductors and the rise of Samsung. And the rise of Samsung didn't bother Japan as much as it should have. So a lot of Japanese companies were so concerned with the domestic bubble that they didn't react. But the rise of China then really made it clear that there was no longer any business profit to be made in the assembly of consumer end products, that China had basically wiped out Japan's previous competitive advantage. What are the strategies that you could adopt to not only escape this new competitive threat, but to actually profit from it? So how would Japan be able to profit from the rise of China? And my answer is that the emerging pattern that I observe is what I call an aggregate niche strategy. So it starts with a smile curve, which actually is, of course, a big thing in Japan, but in the United States, very few people know what it means. It's a U-shaped sort of smiley curve that aims to show where in the production process, which is the bottom line, where in the production process is the money. And the answer is it's not in the assembly, it's upstream and downstream. And so downstream would be things like Best Buy or the Apple Store or maybe, retail, that sort of thing. And upstream is the design and then the input materials that are very important and high end and the production machinery to make things. Right? And so 10 years ago, somebody took apart the original iPhone and realized that at the time it cost $180 to make that iPhone. And that about 36% of that value added in making the iPhone was generated in Japan, followed by 17% in Germany, and some 10% in South Korea, and 2.6% in China. And what was happening there is that Japan was providing the very expensive, very high-tech, very sophisticated films, polarizer film, brightness films, everything that goes into sort of the screen, but then also the back end and the tiny, tiny little connectors. And Japan was very good at cell phone parts at the time because the iMode phone had been a world leader at the turn of the century. So Japan would make these very important chemicals and expensive chemicals that were then shipped to South Korea and Taiwan, where they were put into panels. The panels were then shipped to China, where they're kind of assembled into an iPhone. And so the money in that process is in these very expensive polarizers, right? So the difference between a good panel and a bad panel, monitor panel that you might be looking at right now, is how black is the black? Can you look at it from an angle? Can you view it in the sun? And those films are made by Japanese companies who have a competitive advantage in this. So this repeated, not just the iPhone, not just electronics, it repeats in semiconductors, it repeats in car parts, it repeats in construction machinery. And out of that developed a pattern where Japan's leading companies, not a large number, but Japan's leading companies are occupying product niches where they have more than 50% of global market share. And these niches are small, maybe $5 billion each, $4 billion each. And so you can do the math. If you have 1,000 niches where Japan occupies more than 50%, it adds up. And by the way, it's not just an export story. These are global production networks where a Japanese chemical might be shipped to Korea to be turned into something else that's then sold to Samsung in Korea. And what makes this somewhat stable, I'm not saying that this will last forever, but what makes this somewhat stable is that these niches are currently too difficult to imitate and too difficult to make, and also too small for China. So Chinese companies are perfectly happy to buy these little things because it doesn't scale for them. They can't employ enough people in it. It's perfect for Japan with a shrinking society and a technology edge. So the story about the business reinvention, as I talk about it in my book, is mostly about manufacturing. And that is because the research on these niches and the data are available for manufacturing firms. And most of these stories that I'm telling are technology stories. And then we make a difference now between so-called shallow tech and deep tech. And those are actually real words. You can Google them. And deep technology advances are advances that really change the way the world works, right? So it could be shifting energy sources to renewables, or suddenly having a car that doesn't have an engine but a motor, and those are big changes. And my interest in particular is how Japanese manufacturing companies are positioning in these deep tech industries. But that's only one part of the story. Another very interesting part that's going on is Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia. And then that's partially in manufacturing. So, for instance, Toyota and SoftBank have a joint venture where they're providing mobility services all over Southeast Asia, in the process collecting a lot of data that can then be used for the digital transformation, the new data mining, AI, so forth applications. And the banking sector is also very interesting because, or insurance for that matter. Imagine again, you're a CEO in Japan. You know that the Japanese market is not going to grow. There's a population decline. The forecast is very clear. Unless something completely unexpected happens, the Japanese population will fall below 100 million people over the next 20 years. So who to sell banking services to, or insurance services, or even travel services? And the next stop for Japan is to expand into Southeast Asia. So it's very interesting how Japanese companies have been very active in mergers and acquisitions in Southeast Asia and are developing quite a network in providing services there. They're already, of course, heavily invested in the United States, also in manufacturing. And so there's another story to be told, not only about what's happening within Japan, but also the Japanese positioning in foreign markets. Let me just add one aspect to this, right? So I mentioned that one of the challenges is if you're the CEO of this company or the senior management, how do you change an old style Japanese companies into this new Japan deep technology leader with breakthrough innovations that require some risk taking and experimenting and things that we generally think are a little bit alien to Japanese business culture. And that is one of the most interesting topics for me right now, and also one of the biggest challenges in Japan. Because the old Japan business practices, whether that's the Toyota production system or even how the banks function, is valuable for certain things. So in manufacturing, Japan's prized patterns of meticulous order following, not breaking anything, being very exact, being a hard worker, working long hours, doing exactly as told, PDCA cycles is really good for instance, chemical production, which is very difficult to do. But for this new Japan, we also need innovation that is about risk-taking, break it, fix it, be at the frontier of technology. And that is a very different mindset. And so what we're seeing in Japan right now, which is quite interesting, is how more and more of these leading companies are developing new processes in the office to incentivize their workers to be more loose about certain things. So, for instance, there are now a lot of free address offices where workers don't even have a desk anymore. They come in the morning, and then pick a work environment that suits the needs of the day. If they have a meeting, they find a room. If they need to be quiet, they find a quiet place. If they need to be creative, they find a space. And then that's, maybe just like Silicon Valley. But what's so interesting to me with this episode is that the challenge for the employee is that in the old practice in Japan, working long hours was a very important aspect of a performance evaluation. That bosses would say, "Oh yeah, that employee works really hard," and all the gambare spirit and the ishokemme, and so the hard work was rewarded. But in this new system, if you're in a free address office space, the boss may not know at any given point in time where you actually are. So it's re-incentivizing Japanese employees towards creating outcomes and putting less aspect on the process and more emphasis on the outcome. And that is a fundamental change in Japanese business culture that I find very interesting. So my next project is actually about the digital transformation and demographic change. And a lot of people think they know what it is. I mean, there's very little agreement at this point, but we know what demographic change is. The Japanese population is aging and shrinking, and it's the first in the world that is aging and shrinking at a very rapid rate. The digital transformation extends from anywhere from Industry 4.0 to 5G and constant interconnectivity to AI, ML, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data mining. And there's no country in the world that can escape either one of those. But Japan is a little bit special because for Japan, being a front runner in the aging society, these two events are happening at the exact same time. And usually we think of them as negative, right? So demographic change is bad, shrinking is bad, because we don't have enough workers and the society is getting too old. Meanwhile, a lot of people think about the digital transformation as very threatening. Will it lead to displacement? Will workers no longer be needed? Will jobs be lost? But guess what? For Japan, this is almost like a lucky moment where the shrinking society coincides with the arrival of automated systems. And so the question then becomes, can Japan exploit and use to its benefit this coincidence, this confluence of these two events that happen at the exact same time? And so I do this with the co-author, and we've looked at a variety of industries: agriculture, manufacturing, even wholesale and logistics, where soon blockchain will bring a big upheaval to Japan's very convoluted wholesaler retailer system. But that's actually a really good example of this lucky moment, because the average age of a Japanese wholesaler company, the CEO of a wholesaler company, is 75. And so they're retiring anyway at exactly this moment where blockchain is arriving. So that is my next research project to show how the digital transformation is reinforcing the business reinvention of Japan. Yeah, so my webinar series is called the Japan Zoominar, which is a pun on the Japanese word for zemi, which is a professor's course at the university, but it's not a seminar, it's a Zoominar because we're zooming this. And the idea came to me during the onset of the pandemic when our Japan Center, JFIT, was closed down. And so what can we do? Well, we can go on the Zoom like everybody else. And so I started a weekly conversation that lasts 1 hour. It brings a guest in who is either the author of a recent publication, or a journalist, or former politician, a former central banker, a cybersecurity expert, an art historian. Anything goes as long as it's related to Japan. And we have a conversation for an hour. And this has been successful beyond expectations. We have more than 20,000 views of these Zoominars. And I think one of the things that people seem to like, at least what I get from customer feedback, is that it is so widely laid out. So we have looked at women in the workplace. We have looked at contemporary art, history, Shibusawa Eiichi and Prime Minister Kishida's New Capitalism, geostrategy, so geopolitics, geoeconomics. I mentioned cybersecurity, of course, business strategy, economics. We've even had Hello Kitty, and that girls' power, and that it is no joke, but a real economic engine. And so, and I don't know what the future will bring. I will be interested in any and all topics that are related to Japan. And I'm told that that our viewers also use this as a podcast because it's a conversation, right? So you don't actually have to follow some PowerPoints if you don't like to.
Japan Up Close.